With us now for context and analysis from the perspective of risk, we're joined by global consulting firm Managing Director Bob Herrera-Lim. Good to see you again. Welcome back to the program, Bob.
Good morning, Kathy.
All right, so the Senate impeachment trial is going to be convened tomorrow. What are the scenarios that you're considering at this point?
Okay, so I think a couple of things. The first thing is, I don't think it's very likely that they'll hold a continuous trial that some sectors have been advocating. They might make a show of starting it just so that it's in the records and it happens. That's what the people or the politicians who would like Sara's trial to continue would like to happen. The second is the Senate gets bogged down on the question of whether or not they can continue as an impeachment court beyond June the 30th. And that's those two issues, those two questions are going to be debated ferociously over the next few days. The outcome is not clear on what side they will come out on. So really the scenario is one of continuing uncertainty for the near term about where all of this is going, whether it's on the procedural matters in the next few days or the long-term outlook for Vice President Sara Duterte and the Marcos administration.
And that uncertainty is cause for concern for the CEOs and senior leaders that you advise. What is definite in your view is the outcome of this week's Senate debates, because it could influence what you say is the political outlook for the next 3 years. But how so?
Yeah, so if it doesn't go to trial, let's say it is dismissed this week by the Senate, then there will be a strong sense that Sara Duterte remains a powerful force in Philippine politics and that the Duterte family remains a powerful force in politics that has to be reckoned with, because that is the reason the Senate or senators will vote against continuing her trial, which means that you would basically see the two most powerful or prominent families in the country standing opposed to each other. I do not think there will be any reconciliation between them. So Marcos has to deal with sort of the sword hanging over him of a Duterte succession. Now, on the other hand, if the trial does continue, obviously there will be the question of whether the impeachment trial will find Sara Duterte guilty, but it could be very damaging for her because all the allegations about corruption, misuse of funds, whether true or not, could come out. And it could damage the Duterte family brand where she becomes less viable as a candidate in 2028. So I think whatever happens in the next 2 to 3 weeks will have a definite effect on Philippine politics 2 to 3 years out even.
Well, given the extent of the impact, what kind of strategic counsel then are you now providing the CEOs and the senior executives, given what we know now and that we have yet to ascertain?
Okay, our view is twofold. First of all, you have a lot of uncertainty. It's not just the Philippine uncertainty, right? It's the uncertainty on the tariffs, it's the uncertainty on the global trade front, and what happens on all of these combined. So our counsel right now is one of course, risk always exists. You cannot avoid it. But the challenge is therefore to identify the risk scenarios and to find out how these scenarios could affect your planning. And I think right now, the main advice we give, especially those investing in the Philippines, is there are bad outcomes, right? There are outcomes where we can have some instability, but there are decent outcomes. As we saw in the midterms, there was sort of a fundamental protest vote against the binary formulation of Philippine politics, against the politics being defined simply as Marcos versus Duterte. And we've discussed the possibility of a third force coming in, a force that says it's not just about the politics of Marcos versus Duterte. It could be about improving governance, because some people might be fed up with just simply politics about these two families. So there is a silver lining in the clouds, which we have to wait, evolve, and which might become more visible over the next 2-3 months. So again, our advice to CEOs, our advice to investors is keep doing your business as you've been doing it. Watch out for the risky scenarios, but at the same time, do not disregard the possibility that you might see at least a less potent or less, shall we say, divided politics, maybe 6 months to a year from now, depending on what happens in the next 2 to 3 months.
When you say keep doing what you're doing right now, does that mean expanding CapEx or maybe waiting and seeing what happens next?
Yeah, no, I think the view here is you have a baseline view, if you're a CEO, right, on how the economy might grow. The biggest worry for many CEOs is if let's say Sara, in the scenario that Sara rises as a political force, does the Duterte family go after some of the allies of the Marcos family? And if that's the case, and you're a business that's seen as being part of what Duterte has railed against in the past, the oligarchy or Marcos allies, does that make you more careful? I think if you're one of these families, if you're one of these business groups, you have to watch the trials going on, because if the probability of a Duterte return increases, then that uncertainty for you increases. This is independent, of course, of whether or not Duterte is right or wrong, or whether or not the charges against him or her, him when I refer to the president in The Hague, are correct. But definitely the Dutertes are outsiders to the elite politics of the country. And you might see, and whenever an outsider threatens the established or entrenched order, it's always a risk for the people who are in power or their close allies.
Just as a final point, the global trade policy uncertainty, where does that play out then in these level of risks that we just mentioned?
Nothing is certain yet on what will happen with global trade, right? Everyone's waiting for what happens with China, and then everyone's waiting for July 9th. Everyone's waiting for the bigger economies. There is very, very little or no certainty yet on where trade policy might fall. Obviously, we've heard the baseline is maybe we get to 10% to 15% tariffs at the end of the day, because anything beyond that is just too painful for the world. But that's an uncertain call. That's an uncertain outcome yet, and it'll probably take 2 to 3 months more. And then finally, there's the question of if tariffs resume, what effect does that have on U.S. consumption? What effect does that have on the Chinese economy? There are still many, many effects that we're waiting for. So that, for me, is the bigger uncertainty.
So many questions yet to be answered, but thank you for giving us a certainty amid the uncertainty. Bob Herrera-Lim of Teneo.